So the rest of tonight is going to be really a recap of a lot of the Cold War that we've already talked about. And the analysis of why the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended really so suddenly for a lot of international observers is still being debated today. So some of these things are fairly controversial, but I think it's pretty well proven that these were some of the causes, if not the major causes, of the Soviet collapse in 1989 going into 91. The thing to remember about today, we're going to do this in kind of a history of ideas rather than just a year-by-year history. So we're going to talk about economics first from World War II going in the 1980s. Then we'll talk about technology going back to World War II to the 80s, then ideology. So the thing to remember about this lecture is the claims that the Soviet leaders make in the early Cold War, that the Soviet Union's economy is going to outproduce the United States, technologically outbuild the United States, and be the source of human freedom ideologically in the whole world. All those are very clearly proven false by the 1980s, and many world populations came to understand that very, very clearly. So I'll start off with economics. In World War II, many economists and even a whole lot of historians, and even the Allied commander of the Western forces, Eisenhower of World War II, later wrote a book talking about, battle-by-battle history of World War II. And in that book, even Eisenhower said that the major reason the U.S. won World War II is because its economic power. It built more stuff than Germany. It built more tanks, more planes, more bombs, had more soldiers eventually. He called it the victory of supply. The U.S. industry, U.S. factories cranked out a lot more war materials than Germany ever could. And in fact, when the Americans started bombing German factories, the imbalance was made much more extreme. So mere economic and industrial power had largely won World War II for the United States in combination with its allies. Of course, Europe was mostly destroyed by the war. And the United States decided in 1947, going forward, to use its economic power to rebuild the economies of its allied countries in the Cold War by this point. And this was known as the Marshall Plan. So you saw by the late 50s a very stark contrast economically between Western Europe, supported, funded, and rebuilt by U.S. money, by U.S. investment, and the rest of Europe, Eastern Europe, that was dominated by communist economies and Soviet control, because the Soviets did not allow their countries under their control to accept Marshall Plan aid. And those countries fell behind the West economically very, very fast, and they never recovered. Many Western European countries started coming together in the 1950s to build an economic community because they realized that unified economic power would be a base of their political and military power in the Cold War. So the very early economic unions in Europe are first created 1953-54, the European Coal and Steel Community, just to combine certain industries. But that grew in 1957 to be the European Economic Community. And you can see largely built up in West Germany, France, Italy, and later would grow into taking Great Britain. This is the forerunner of today's European Union, the EU. So it started off as an economic tying together and has moved consistently over the past few decades, especially toward a political unification, to the point where some observers say this may become like a United States of Europe at some point. But it was a general recognition that economic power creates military power. And they unified their economies in a lot of different ways in the 50s going forward to build basically a Western Europe bloc to resist a possible Soviet incursion. And of course, the United States, the 1950s, was a boom time, very generally, one of the greatest economic booms in all of human history. Largely because the European industries, factories had all been destroyed by the war and hadn't been completely rebuilt yet. So again, if you wanted to buy anything, made in a factory throughout the world, you largely had to buy it from an American factory, from an American company. So the U.S. economy grew dramatically in the 1950s, and you have all the kind of trappings of wealth and power. You get technological innovations, you get more powerful cars, you get a kind of mass consumer society that becomes really obsessed with buying televisions and houses, and the economic prosperity spread very deeply down into the middle class, largely through labor unionization, to the point where they got paid enough money to own a house and own a car and own a kind of stable middle class lifestyle. So we've talked about that already much earlier when we talked about the 50s in general. So you see the rise of mass suburban housing, consistently built. We talked about Levittown and its impacts psychologically in a lot of ways. But this suburban style continues to today, very obviously. The growth of the food industry, and particularly the fast food industry, as McDonald's becomes the first to innovate and create a factory line, an assembly line style of food production. And that style was implemented in a lot of different industries. You get the rise of consumer spending on things that are, not needed for life, like food or housing. Americans start spending more money on especially movies and music, and of course the rising television industry, and also sports. This is where you start getting baseball and football and whatnot becoming huge businesses. They had been around for decades already, but these become giant corporations. Whereas the Soviet economy, and in general the East European economy, were controlled completely by the government. These are communist economies, where the government owns all the factories, or virtually all the factories, maybe private ones out there. But the government basically runs the entire economy, not just by oversight or slight regulation like you have in the West with capitalism, but communism, the government literally owns the factory. So if you're a factory worker, you are a government employee. If you're a teacher, you're a government employee, obviously. Almost anything you do, anything that is made, is proposed, accepted, built, and paid for by government. So these economies are very tightly regulated. And the focus of especially the Soviet economy, ever since the 1920s, was to build war materials. Tanks, guns, bullets. That was going all the way back to ideas of Trotsky, Lenin, and Stalin. So after World War II, and of course the Soviet Union took the overwhelming brunt of the violence of German invasions in World War II, Stalin, still the leader in the Soviet Union, decided that it was still necessary to build up as much military power as possible. Therefore, Stalin and his leadership decided to dedicate virtually all Soviet factories to making the tanks and planes and bombs that had won World War II, just in case the capitalist countries, the West, tried to invade. So they continue that focus, and of course, the more proportionally you have your factories dedicated to making the machines of war, the less factories you have to make clothes, shoes, soap, and the general things that the average population buys. Does that make sense? So the average population, even though the factories are churning out huge amounts of goods, most of those goods are military, there are general shortages of things like razor blades for shaving, or soap, or water bottles, or the average thing that people need on a daily basis, the average materials that the common people use. So even though their factory system is fairly efficient in cranking out goods, they're not popular goods. And a lot of people in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe by the 50s start to recognize that. And they start to get upset, and they start quietly trying to get demands going for increased amounts of things that the average people need. And that's what we call consumer goods. And the longer a government does that, the greater risk it takes in really angering its own population. And when the population is angry and the government has the military on its side, you can see where that conflict can go very quickly. if the people rise up or start to organize to complain about government decisions, sometimes they're arrested and slaughtered in the streets if there's a mass protest. And the Soviet Union continues that policy even after Stalin's death in 1953. They continue the policy of purging opponents, and anyone who speaks out against government is labeled a traitor, kind of closet terrorist, capitalist, who's trying to bring down the whole Soviet system, whereas they might just be complaining about not having enough chairs in society. So the mass population is making great sacrifices, and their complaints are largely either ignored or repressed by the government. There's also state control over media. Obviously, the governors, the rulers of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the communist rulers, keep control over the movies and the music that are permitted to be made. There are not many individual artists out there, songwriters, actors, whatever, directors, writers. If you want to get your work published, it has to go through the government system, and the government will pay you for your work. And they had a heavy censorship system because they were very afraid that a lot of these popular complaints will seep into the movies, just like the Americans were in the 1950s about communist ideas somehow getting into the movies, where a character wearing a red hat in a movie may be too symbolically linked to communism, so they eliminate red colors a lot in movies in the 40s and 50s. But the Soviet Union was even much more heavy-handed. They don't just investigate, the people they accuse of bringing capitalist ideas into their movies, they're just eradicated. They don't even get put on trial very much. Or their careers destroyed, because who else is going to pay you for your art? The government is the final decision maker on all movies being made. And there's a very obvious attempt by the Soviets and the Eastern European dictators to keep Western culture out. They do not want American music getting into the Soviet Union. They do not want rock and roll or jazz or any of those kinds of things, because those imply freedom, and the freedom to move and the freedom to speak out. So they don't want their populations hearing that message. So they especially block out U.S. and Western European radio broadcasts. So if you're living in East Europe or the Soviet Union and you tune your radio to that frequency to get a Western broadcast, to get maybe American music, instead you will get a high-pitched screech that feels like it's coming from the center of your brain and will drive you insane. If you listen really closely, you might hear a little snippet, like really low volume of the music you were trying to get access to, but the squealing wail of that pitch is just too painful to put up with. And they obviously don't want to let many American writers into the Soviet Union. You don't get many American artists going to the Soviet Union. So it's eventually a very big deal when the Beatles are allowed in. But it is government control over the population. Not just political, but also social. Okay. Next step. The Soviet Union was not as efficient by the 1970s as it promised to its own population. And one of the biggest symbolic places where the Soviet economy was starting to fail very dramatically was in food production. The Soviet Union has a gigantic country, the biggest in the world territorially, so you would think that they would have enough land to grow enough food to feed its large population. The Soviet Union started experiencing crop failures and a lot of other kind of even bureaucratic problems. And eventually, by the mid-70s, they can't even grow enough food to feed the Soviet people. So in a great international embarrassment, they have to buy food from the United States. Which, of course, American leaders promote, and they advertise this idea throughout the world, as the failures of communist economies. And it's hugely embarrassing for Soviet leaders. Yeah?
If they had so much land and people, why couldn't they keep up with production?
Well, whenever you get a completely government-dominated bureaucracy, you're going to get corruption. And you're going to get workers in government that, government workers, they get a consistent salary every year, right? No matter how good you work, or no matter how much work you do, or no matter how hard you work, you're going to get that set salary. So the complaint is, the criticism is that they don't have the motivation to work really hard and work really efficiently. So a lot of these government workers, they get their little office or they get their place on assembly line, and they will do as little as possible. Because what's the point working hard if you're going to get paid the same no matter what, right? That's one of the very general complaints about communism. It's a powerful criticism that they don't have the profit motive. And even the guy who perfected the AK-47, Kalashnikov, the major Soviet rifle that they use in their armies, he would have had a government contract and probably become very wealthy in the United States with that innovation. But the Soviet government just took it from him and said thanks. They didn't pay him for it. Thanks for your dedication to the cause. So that's one example. The profit motive just isn't there for inventiveness or efficiency. Whereas it completely is in capitalism, right? The harder you work, the more you save, the more you can invest, the more money you make, and you can become rich, theoretically. But that's not even possible in the Soviet Union in almost any circumstance. So by the 1970s, the Soviet economy is failing, and failing in public ways. And it's very difficult for even the Soviet government to hide it from its own people. But the Westerners, especially the American leaders, are very afraid of the Soviet economy, even though it's sputtering and it's seemingly going backward in a lot of instances. Why is that? Because the Soviet government ran its economy completely. Therefore, the government can decide to make whatever it wanted. If the U.S. government decided it wanted to make 3,000 more planes one year than the year before, that has to get approved by Congress. The money has to be studied. I mean, there's public institutions that you can influence by voting. If the American population doesn't want to build those 3,000 tanks, they call up their congressman and say, don't vote for this. Right? If you vote for it, I'll vote against you in your next re-election. That's not possible in the Soviet Union. Their leaders are not elected by the population. They're elected by the highest bureaucratic levels, just like we've seen in communist China, even this past week. They just appointed their new administration for the next 10 years. The people didn't have a vote in that. It was the highest levels of the party that decided. And the same thing happened in the Soviet Union. So the Soviet economy is completely controlled by government. So if the Soviet government decided, we want to make 5,000 more nuclear weapons next year, they'll just do it. Population doesn't have any ability to stop it. So the Western governments were still afraid of the Soviet economy, as inefficient and even backward as it was becoming, because they could direct their money and their resources to whatever the government wanted. Does that make sense? It's what we call command economy. The government made decisions and everyone fell in line, or else they were attacked. So questions about that at all? Question about any of this stuff at all? I know it's a lot theoretical and seems kind of abstract, but this was a daily life for a lot of Soviet people for decades. And they become very upset about it fairly quickly. And that anger and that disillusionment by especially the East European populations, and especially the East Germans, became a giant problem for the Soviets in the 1950s. Because especially East Germans started to leave as fast as they could. They recognized that the West was booming. The West has more cultural and economic freedoms. Even with the racist restrictions and all those kinds of things, cultural restrictions in the United States, they realized it's a much freer place to live than the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe. And so they do what historians call voting with their feet. They don't want to live in one place, so they get up and move. They go to another place. And they were doing this through West Berlin. And East Germany in particular is losing not just general population, but its educated population. It's doctors and lawyers and teachers and writers. Generally, the people are recognized as the most dominant kind of class in society, not just their average factory workers or house builders or whatever. They're losing the educated elite from their society. And that seems to be what convinced the Soviets to build the Berlin Wall. Again, usually when you build a wall, you do it to keep others out, right? to keep the robbers or whoever out. In this instance, they built the wall to keep their own people in. They built the wall and then pointed their guns inward, which is an interesting idea. And that just reveals how economically backward and troublesome the Soviet economy and the East European economies had become, because people were just leaving in droves. They didn't want to be there anymore. And they have to take this very dramatic step to keep their people in. So that's the economics of it. There's a whole other kind of subset of economics, which is the technological developments. Yeah.
As far as schooling goes, was there less people trying to become educated because of they got paid the same thing?
Well, there's two sides of that. There may be less people trying to get educated because you can just go into the factory and make the same amount no matter what. But if you want access to power and the wealth that existed in the Soviet Union, you have to get into the government high levels of bureaucracy, right? And you don't do that without having advanced degrees.
But as far as, let's say, like an artist or something like that, they weren't trying or anything, or just for like history.
How highly educated are many of the leading artists in society, right? A lot of them are just dropouts. They're so upset with what they see around them that they start writing music and whatnot to complain about it. And, they aren't usually the big educated members anyway. I mean, the people who have the degrees at least. But education is a wishy-washy kind of term, right?
So all the education was leading toward politics and government.
Yeah, especially in engineering, mathematics, and science, as much as they possibly could. Yeah. Which the United States even advertised too in the 1950s, right? Without doubt. I mean, the United States started funding, giving huge amounts of scholarships to students who want to go into mathematics and science. So they feel that they're falling behind the Soviets in the technological Cold War. And again, going back to World War II, technology obviously had a big impact on the war, especially most dramatically the atomic bombs, but also in the development of things like saturation bombings, all these kinds of engineering feats, radar. They invent radar during World War II. They break German codes in World War II, largely done by the British. And they start building the first computer systems in World War II, largely to break the German codes. So that's where the computer industry really gets going. Okay, so technology has a huge impact, and in the aftermath of the war and the early years of the Cold War, it appears internationally that the Soviets are catching up to the West, and the Soviet leaders say, we're not just catching up, but we're going to overtake you. We're going to be more technologically innovative and more advanced than even the Americans in a few decades. And it seemed to be proved by the fact that the Soviets got the bomb and then the hydrogen bomb very quickly after the Americans. And that they actively portrayed the Soviet Union as having this military power. Instead of marching their troops through on parades, they line up their missiles in Moscow and run them through the big city centers and whatnot. It's a funny circumstance because they didn't have a whole lot of those missiles. So they literally took the 5 or 6 that they had and ran them through the parade again and again in circles to make it look like they had 50 or 60. And the CIA had people out in the audience watching this and saying, "Oh my God, look at all these missiles they got coming through," but they didn't really take notice as to the same couple missiles going through over and over again. But that's stuff that the Soviets do just to have the image of military strength without the major reality of it, at least in nuclear terms, until the late 60s, early 70s. And the Soviets appear to not just be catching up, but by the late 50s, they start actively looking like they're overtaking the Americans and fulfilling that promise, that threat. The biggest thing that they accomplished in the 50s is the launch of Sputnik, which is the first artificial satellite, man-made satellite to be put in orbit around the world. So this happens in 57 and is accompanied by Soviet claims throughout the world that we have overtaken the Americans. We're going to go even further. So in the next few decades, we're going to be so far advanced technologically from the United States that it's not even going to be a question anymore. And the American population was outraged and very, very scared. Because the technology that you need to put something in orbit can also put nuclear weapons in orbit. And this is the first building of the ICBMs and eventually the MIRVs. So when Americans could go outside their door at night and look up in the sky and see this blinking little light traveling, that was the Soviet threat that they could watch from their own backyard. And the American population went into a panic. They start talking about falling technologically behind. There seems to be some evidence that the Soviets have many more nuclear missiles than the Americans do. And so a lot of American politicians start talking about a so-called missile gap, that the Americans have fallen behind, so you have to build a ton of missiles to catch up real fast. But this is also where the American government starts offering those major scholarships to college students that are going into math and engineering particularly. Because they want to build. They want to catch up with what they see as the technologically advanced Soviet Union. Little did they know this would be the high point of Soviet technological innovation. But there's this feeling in the late 50s that the Americans have fallen behind. They have to do something about it. Interestingly, President Eisenhower, who's in the White House at this time, knew statistically that the Americans had not fallen behind because he has spies in the Soviet Union. And he is secretly flying spy planes over Soviet airspace and taking pictures of Soviet missile sites. So the American leaders knew the reality of how many missiles the Soviets actually had. But because those are spy types things, they can't put that information out to the general public, right? That's secret stuff. So there's not much they can do to calm the American people and give much evidence, because the evidence was gained through underhanded violations of Soviet territory. And then you get in the late 60s, the massive buildup that eventually catches up. We've already talked about that to a certain extent. But in the 1960 election, now Eisenhower served 2 terms. Constitutionally, he's out. The Democratic candidate, John Kennedy, talks about the missile gap constantly because he's a Democrat, Eisenhower's a Republican. So this is a opposition political criticism of those in power, basically saying, throw the Republicans out, and I, as the Democratic Party leader, elect me, and I will build a ton of missiles to eliminate the missile gap. And when he is elected, he goes into office in January 61 and gets the secret evidence that there is no missile gap. In fact, the United States already has more missiles than the Soviets. But he's made a campaign promise, and a very public one. And he can't reveal secret sources. So he has a decision to make. Does he still go through with the building of these thousands of new missiles? Or does he go to the American public and say, look, it turns out I was wrong? How many times do presidents ever do that? Almost never. So Kennedy continued and got those thousands of new missiles built because it was his campaign promise, which put great fear into the hearts of the Soviet leaders. The Soviets probably only had a few hundred missiles. The Americans at that point probably had about 1,000 or 1,500. So building 3,000 brand new ones is a massive increase proportionally. And the Soviets had to figure out, how do you stop the United States from now going off and using this new power to get more influence in the world? And the answer to that question that the Soviet leader Khrushchev came up with was to take a few missiles and put them in Cuba as a symbolic defiance of American power in the world. And that launched the two sides and the whole world off onto the path of the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62. And Kennedy gave in '61 one of the more famous inauguration speeches ever. And it's a very interesting one to read, where he promises we're going to negotiate for peace, we're going to try to end the nuclear buildup, even when he's doing it himself. And he makes a lot of promises about coming together to help the poor of the world, not just because we want to humiliate the Soviets, but because it's just the right thing to do. But he also, in that same speech, said that the United States would, quote, bear any burden and resist any foe in the world to protect its power, which is a pretty militaristic stance to take, right? Any enemy that rises up, we will defend ourselves against. So Kennedy symbolizes and talked about a lot of different things, but when you analyze a lot of his own policies, largely did not fulfill a whole lot of that stuff. He also symbolizes, he's a much younger person than Eisenhower was by a few decades. So Kennedy largely symbolizes that the new generation of American leaders and the American population is now willing to take up its fight in the Cold War. Cold War was created in the 40s, 15 years before. So Kennedy, and even in his address, says that the new rising generation of American leaders is willing to fight the Cold War and continue it. And I think the quote is something like, let the word go forth that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, something like that. So it's a very famous thing that he said, but he made a promise to the world that the United States, with the new rising generation, is not going to just stop the Cold War and then go back to isolationism. He said, we will continue it and we will win it. So his speech is interesting in a whole lot of different ways. So questions about him in relation to the technological aspect of all this. Oh, okay. Whoops. What happened here? All right. Khrushchev was the major leader of the Soviet Union after Stalin. Stalin died in 1953. It took a few years for the new leadership to come together and consolidate power. But Khrushchev accomplished that by 1956. So Khrushchev was in power for a few years and is largely taken out as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was Khrushchev's policy to put those missiles there. And when he backs down in the face of American threats, the communist leaders, the Communist Party, decide to replace him in the next couple of years. Again, it takes him a couple of years to knock him out and knock his followers out. But the new leaders will be under a guy named Brezhnev, and he'll be in power until the early 80s. So you have basically, you wouldn't call it exactly a coup because they're not killing Khrushchev and all of his followers. They're just knocking him out of office and they go off into retirement. But you have, again, the next leaders, the next group rising in the Soviet Union. And Brezhnev, under his administration, this is where the Soviet Union goes into major problems that are never solved. Instead of bringing more innovation and encouraging more innovation, possibly through stipends or payments or something to people who did innovate and create more efficient systems or work really hard, Brezhnev really goes back to the central planning model, which is the command economy, which created gigantic problems for the Soviets and tends to cause major problems whenever this hardcore communism rises. The problem is that you have this massive government-led bureaucracy that is making all the economic decisions in the country. And if you're a factory worker or a car maker or an artist or teacher or whoever you are, you're a government employee. So you get paid a set salary year by year. And no matter how hard you work, no matter how good at your job you are, you will get that set salary. So the theory rises, and it seems fairly natural that when people have nothing more to gain by working very much harder, nothing to gain for themselves, that they won't do it. As when I worked retail when I was in college, and I was getting paid minimum wage, and one of my bosses came to me and said, "Well, you don't look like you're working very hard today." And my response was, minimum wage results in minimum work. I will do the little that I can to not get fired. And don't expect that much more above and beyond that when you're paying $5 an hour. I mean, how many boxes can I unload? How many boxes am I willing to move for that little money? You'll get your $5 an hour. Not much more beyond that, though. And that was the problem with the Soviet Union. And communism in general, this hardcore communism. When you pay these set salaries, where if you're a factory worker, you're going to make your $40,000 a year, whatever it is, why really work yourself to death if you're not going to make any more money off of it? And if you are a scientist, why work real hard to come out with new scientific inventions or innovations or new systems or something if the government's going to take your invention and use it and they're not going to give you any more money for it? The profit motive is not there. Therefore, a lot of workers just will drag their feet and do as little as possible. And in that way, it kills economic progress, economic growth, and especially technological innovation. You just don't get a whole lot of new inventions in the Soviet Union. And by the 70s, they have fallen far, far behind the United States technologically also. U.S. companies invent what we today call the microchip in 1959, and the first microprocessor, which is small-scale circuit to run computers in the 60s. And that's the point where, if you've seen computers from the 1950s, they'd fill up the size of this whole room, right? That's where you start getting computer technology advancing very fast, to the point where the computer you have in your pocket, in your phone, is more advanced than a lot of the computing power the whole CIA had. It is astronomical, and it's growing even faster today. So the United States starts undergoing, especially that computer-based technological growth, and greater efficiency as companies and industries start figuring out how to use computers to streamline their production or their sales or whatever they're doing. Whereas the Soviet Union just didn't have computers. They had the 1950s room-full computers, even in the 1980s. And there's some really funny stories about when like U.S. leaders would meet at a political summit with Soviet leaders in the 1980s to discuss some kind of peace deal or some kind of weapons deal or something like that, some kind of nuclear compromise. The Americans would show up with their speeches already typed, and of course they read them the night before, and sometimes they make little last-minute changes and whatnot, and they have to make copies so everyone would have a copy of the speech, at the meeting, so everyone could read along. So when they made last-minute changes, they just went to a Xerox machine and literally just ran off copies. They went to the copy machine. The Soviets didn't have a copy machine. So when they went to these summits, they had to bring huge amounts of typists and secretaries. So when they made last-minute changes to their speech, the whole thing has to be retyped by hand. Click, click, click on typewriters. And they would show up late to meetings because they didn't have enough speeches to give everybody. I mean, just on that kind of real world, just little level, shows you the amount of technological progress that the United States had gone far, far beyond the Soviets in. And the only place that the Soviets ever really keep up technologically is nuclear weapons, because they devote huge amounts of resources to those kinds of inventions, but not much else for kind of the common people, for the consumer goods. So Brezhnev really oversees the technological, increasingly backwardness of the Soviet Union, that eventually it just becomes understood amongst the common people around the world that the Soviets have fallen far behind. So when you have a choice to make about which side you want to ally yourself with, or which place, if you can get out, which place you want to go live, a lot of people choose to go to the West. They don't want to go to the East because it's economically and technologically backward. So questions about that at all? And in the last instance, it's violent. Going all the way back even to the 1920s, but especially after World War II, Stalin is around, he's in power, and he advertises the idea, and his leadership advertises throughout the world, that Marxism is infallible. It is perfect. It was the perfect economic analysis and gave the perfect solution for the inequalities and the problems of capitalism. And communists throughout the world, even today, tend to believe that Marx was perfect. His book was perfect. There is nothing wrong with it. It is infallible. And that communism creates equality throughout society. You get rid of the rich and the poor, the powerful and the weak. Everyone will be paid the same salary, so you're not going to have these mass inequalities like you see in capitalist countries very often. So Stalin and his leadership said that the idea was perfect, and in implementing it, they create the future of real human freedom in the world. that the Soviet Union and communism would be the source of human liberty. And that naturally, people would choose to live in communist areas because of that equality and that so-called freedom. The problem with that is that they built up political dictatorships where you didn't really have the freedom to say and go and do what you wanted. You definitely didn't have the freedom to vote for your leaders. So even though Stalin and the communists, even throughout the world today, say that communism will spread by the choice of the people because people want freedom, in reality, communism tends to only spread through violence. And after World War II, that was very evident because communism only spread into Eastern Europe because the Soviet army was occupying those places and building up dictatorships in those countries. That if the people or even the governors of those countries got out of line, they were eliminated. So it's the promise of freedom, theoretically, but if you live in those areas, the reality is dictatorship and the threat of violence if you get out of line. So you have a major ideological hypocrisy. And very quickly is well known to the Eastern Europeans. And by the 50s, they're starting to leave. They don't want to live in those dictatorships anymore. Stalin died in 53, in March of 53. So you get another leadership that, again, eventually has to consolidate power. It takes them a couple of years. So Khrushchev and his people come into power by 56, by early 56. And Khrushchev gave a very powerful and very interesting speech at the kind of leadership convention, the so-called Party Congress, in February of 56, and said important things about the Soviet Union politically. That a lot of Soviets understood, the population understood what's going on, but no one's willing to talk about because they're scared. And now you have basically the kind of premier, the president of the country, talking about it. Number one, he said that Stalin was a criminal. Stalin was a mass murderer. And the Stalinist system he built up of intimidation and fear and terrorism of its own population is a crime. So Khrushchev talked about, right at the outset, of getting rid of that Stalinist system as much as possible to allow for more freedom. So people wouldn't be afraid of the government. Second thing he said, Marx believed, and wrote in his book, and future later communists still believe today, that war is inevitable between communism, communist countries, communist economies, and capitalist ones. That their interests are so different from each other that they will fight at some point. So war is inevitable. But Khrushchev is talking in 56, by the time that nuclear weapons are around, so if World War III hits between the United States and Soviet Union, you could talk about the mass destruction of both countries, if not much of the world. So Khrushchev talked about if we do this war, it's going to be unacceptably destructive. So we have to find a way to coexist with the capitalist countries. So he said, war is not inevitable. We have to find a way out of fighting because we will be destroyed. They'll probably be destroyed too, but that's not going to get us anywhere if we're not going to live through it. And that's a very controversial thing also to say to the Communist Party that had been built largely by Stalin and Lenin. And number three, and possibly most important, Khrushchev announced a new foreign policy for the Soviets, which is to allow greater political freedom in the countries that Stalin had literally conquered in the wake of World War II, especially in Eastern Europe. He said the Soviet Union will not fully direct and give orders to other communist-led governments throughout the world, that they will have a certain amount of leeway to make their own decisions. And this is in early 56, and very quickly some Eastern European countries start taking them up on that offer. In around, I think it's August, September of 56, the Polish people and government tried to remove its kind of Stalinist puppets, the people that Stalin had put into place. So there are mass protests, there are government moves to knock those leaders out. They still say they're going to be a communist economy, possibly still allied with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, but they want to get rid of those leaders in particular, bring in a new generation. And in October of 56, Hungary, through more mass protests, they say they want to get rid of their Stalinist leaders, and the new possible leaders start talking about leaving the Warsaw Pact and becoming independent in the Cold War, not aligned with either side. So So very quickly, in just a few months after Khrushchev has given that kind of announcement, and that word spreads throughout, especially the communist world, a couple of countries start making moves to get rid of Stalinism in their own countries. What does Khrushchev do? He uses the Stalinist system of repression. Khrushchev says that what he calls the Hungarian revolt against communism, which who knows if they would have eliminated communism or what, is completely hypocritical in light of his pronouncements of greater freedom for other countries. So Khrushchev said, yes, you can make your own decisions, but when they started making their own decisions and wanted to start choosing their own leadership, Khrushchev sent in the Soviet army and literally invaded Hungary, reconquered the country, killed something along the lines of 30,000 Hungarians. So this becomes a mass slaughter. And the Soviet tanks literally rolled through the capital city to destroy any attempts at independent political thought. So the hypocrisy of the Soviet system is not just economic, saying they're going to outgrow the United States. That didn't happen. It's not technological. It's not just technological. They said they'd out-innovate the United States. That didn't happen. It's now also ideological. The Soviet Union proclaims to be the source of human freedom and equality, but in the real world reality, it isn't. The Soviet politics are still built on fear, terror, and dealing with anyone who gets out of line, dealing with any criticism. The United States has its own amounts of hypocrisy, proclaims to be the source of freedom and equality in the world, even though there's segregation, there's economic inequalities, there's a lot of political problems. But the United States, American society, can come to solutions to its own problems through internal democracy, through the freedom of speech. So McCarthy obviously was a fairly large enemy of freedom of speech in a lot of ways, and freedom of association. McCarthy was eliminated democratically. The Senate censored him, which meant that he wasn't allowed to speak in the Senate anymore, and then he just kicked out of office in his next re-election attempt. So the would-be dictators of the United States are eliminated through popular complaint, through voting. And racial inequalities, segregation, and whatnot start to be broken down, first by the Supreme Court, then by presidents who implement Supreme Court decisions, but largely by mass popular protest. The freedom of association, the freedom to go where people want, to say what they want. And eventually by constitutional amendment, guaranteeing at least the right to vote and right to be considered an actual person. And when you look at after the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, the 16, 17 amendments since the 1790s, are mostly focused on greater equality and greater democracy, more access for more people. So it's largely more of a social document guaranteeing equality. So that's one of the genius pieces of the Constitution, is you create a political democracy, hopefully, and you merge it with a social equality system in one document, in one government document. But the Americans were able to rise up and get rid of a lot of their would-be dictators and a lot of their inequalities. Whereas the Soviets, again and again, make promises of freedom and whatnot. And when in 1968, in the summer of 68, in Czechoslovakia, in the major city Prague, there are mass social movements, mass popular movements, marches that grow. And this is at the same time where the anti-war movement is going on in the U.S. and the hippie movement is growing. And a lot of American observers say, well, now you have a kind of nascent, growing, popular, equality-driven movement in one of the hearts of one of the Soviet satellites. What's going to happen there? The same thing happens as in Hungary. Brezhnev this time sends the Soviet armies into Czechoslovakia and largely does the exact same thing. Destroys the popular movement and ensures that the government follows orders from Moscow. And issues a document, gives a speech that eventually becomes known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, where his major theory is the Soviet Union, as the leader of the communist world, has the right to intervene in any country it's allied with to guarantee the continued existence of communism. He basically argued that the Prague uprisings, the Prague, as they call it, the Prague Summer, was a direct threat to communism. And as kind of the older brother of communism, they have the right and are responsible for guaranteeing communist equality. So again, you get the hypocrisy in the same document of supporting freedom but sending the army to repress it. And it's very well known, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, that there's this major hypocrisy in the Soviet ideology. They promise freedom, but they don't deliver. And when you try to use freedom, they will come in and repress it violently and largely in bloodbaths if that's what they deem necessary. So questions about the Brezhnev Doctrine at all? It is basically a promise to the world that the Soviet army will go in and destroy any independence-minded movements in areas it controls. And whereas in the 1960s, complaints about government were pretty rampant in the 60s and 70s. You have a lot of artists, a lot of writers, musicians and whatnot that are complaining of a mass social movement, an anti-war movement that is completely against government decisions. And they use democratic power to try to change things. And eventually, even probably the would-be biggest, most unpopular would-be dictator in the United States, Nixon, who used his executive powers not to kill people the way the Soviets did, but just to investigate people and to intimidate people. Nixon is forced to resign, again, through democratic process. Through reporters investigating and publishing stories. Eventually through Congress intervening, running investigations itself of Nixon's activities. And eventually through impeachment. They threatened to put the president on trial, and if they find him guilty, to kick him out of office through constitutional process. And a lot of these people who were opposed to the Vietnam War, or opposed to Nixon, conservatives label them communists. And you get a lot of interesting statements, like one of my favorite is this guy holding up a sign saying, "I am not a communist and I still oppose the Vietnam War." So just because I oppose the war doesn't mean I want to see Soviet-style communism rise in the United States. He says, that's not what I want. I just want an end to the war. But Nixon is basically sent away for the rest of his life, sent into retirement, and never has much access to government anymore, just because he's so unpopular for being against democracy, against the freedom of people to speak out and to associate. So questions about that at all? And the mass social movements, especially the 60s and early 70s, spawn other movements. So you get an environmentalist movement. You get feminist movements that pop up very fast. Gender equality movements. Obviously the civil rights movement was going on. You have a Native American social movement that grows very fast. Gay rights movements that grow very fast. And even anti-nuclear policy movements that grow very fast. So a lot of the advocacy groups that we see in elections and in politics today, they really get a lot of their beginnings in the 50s and 60s, coming out of the beats, coming out of the original civil rights complaints, because they lay bare the hypocrisies of U.S. government ideas and decisions. How can you have freedom when you have these rigidly repressed minorities? Okay, so skipping into the 1980s, all these mass hypocrisies of the Soviet Union, they're known throughout the world. I mean, if you're living in the Soviet Union, you don't even have to sit down and think about it. It's just the reality of the world. Your economy is stagnant, technology is far, far behind the West, and you live in a dictatorship where you don't have voting rights, and if you complain about government, you may disappear. So the Stalinist system was still in place because the people leading the Soviet Union, Khrushchev and then Brezhnev, and then you have a cluster of leaders after Brezhnev died in 82, I think. You have a whole bunch of them that rise and fall very fast because they're all real old. They've been around since World War II. They're all in their 80s and 90s. So the guy who led the KGB rose to be the Soviet premier. Is only there for a couple months because he died of old age. So I think you get 4 of them between 1982 and 85. And in 85, the Soviet high party leaders hold an election to determine the next premier. And it's a very close election that Gorbachev wins. And Gorbachev is seen as a young guy, I mean, in the Soviet Union, in Soviet politics. We look at him and see him not as particularly a young guy, right? But he is seen as the new generation of Soviet leaders because the rest of them who had been in office since the 1930s are all in their 90s. So he is the innovative, new, energetic voice. And he now has control of the Soviet government. And very quickly, when he goes into office, he starts negotiating with Reagan on nuclear policy and military policy. They hold meetings about the Berlin Wall. And the 2 major things that Gorbachev proposes internally is basically an admission of the Soviet economic and technology problems and political problems. So the 2 in combination are called perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika means communism rigidly has failed. There's not enough economic growth in the Soviet Union. It hasn't been for a long time by that point for the Soviets to even catch up to the Americans, much less surpass them. The Soviets have fallen far, far behind economically. So perestroika is the idea that instead of having the government run everything, pick out very important small pieces of the economy, very important industries, and open them up to private ownership and the profit motive. To get workers innovating, working harder, being more efficient. And if it works in some of those small places, small scale areas of the economy, you can put it in more strategic places and get general economic growth going. Glasnost is the political side of that. A person that wants to be innovative largely criticizes a system that already exists, right? Innovators want to change things. They don't want to make things usually better in their mind. You cannot do that in the Soviet Union because if you complain about the system, you get attacked by the government, one way or the other. So Glasnost says, we're no longer going to attack our own population for criticizing the system in place because we need those fresh ideas to come out. If people are afraid of giving new ideas, then everything's going to be stagnant. You're not going to get changes. So perestroika and glasnost are controversial in the Soviet Union, especially for the old conservative kind of hardcore communist leaders. But he gets it, he pushes it through, and these become 2 kind of fundamental pieces of Gorbachev's time in office. You also get the idea that the Soviet Union wants to portray itself as kind of more of the people, more democratic. So they elect a new kind of democratic representative body called the Congress of People's Deputies. It starts to meet in 89, but the high-level party still retains control. But this is a symbolic event. And the combination of people's new ability to speak publicly about problems within the system, accompanied by the possibilities of a new kind of democratic type of process, encourages a lot of people in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe to grow organizations, to complain, and to propose alternatives. And that grows very, very, very fast because that freedom hadn't been there for so long. The people understood that they were repressed and that they had fallen behind the West. And when they get that little opening, they push through as fast as they can. And it goes out of the control for the Soviet leaders very, very fast. So you get mass protest movements that start in the late summer of 89, seemingly almost out of nowhere. People just start gathering in the streets of the major capitals throughout Eastern Europe. And Gorbachev doesn't appear to really know what to do. Probably the biggest step was in early November when Gorbachev basically announced that he would not send in the Soviet army to repress these popular movements. And at that point, that was the release of the floodgates, and those governments started getting toppled just within a couple weeks, one after another. And the old dictators are knocked out of power. Some of them are executed in public the leader of, I think it was Romania, was just brought out to the parking lot in the back of the government building, just machine gunned to death, him and his wife. They just dragged him out and killed him. So that happens. It's not always violent. Sometimes it's kind of a conflict between the protesters and police forces, but very fast all those dictatorships fall, largely because the Soviet leadership said we're not going to send in the Soviet army to protect them, to protect those government leaders. And that was the green light for the mass popular movements to grow and eventually overwhelm their own governments. And the biggest symbol of that was the quick fall of the Berlin Wall, where the people gathered outside the wall and chanted for it to be opened. And just, I think around 11 o'clock at night or something, one of the Berlin city leaders was asked, will you allow people to go through? Will you open up the gates? And he said yes. And so people just flooded through, and the guards at the gates just couldn't stop it. And very quickly they started getting out their sledgehammers and whatnot and tore the wall down, often with their own bare hands. So you can see the outrage that had built up for decades and the desire for freedom. And once they got that opportunity and they didn't have to fear the government repression, they took it. And they really plowed through and destroyed those governments one after another very, very fast. So this Cold War that had lasted almost 45 years by that point is over in just a matter of weeks. And it's shocking. Most of the international observers and foreign policy types of analysts, even in the United States, said that the Cold War would never end without World War III. It was going to take the next major international conflict to convince the Soviets to give up or to destroy the Soviet government. So there was a lot of feeling that the Cold War would go on forever. Because if you get World War III, you could get nuclear war, which could destroy all of humanity. So you got books published in the 70s and even the 80s saying that the Cold War is going to go on for decades and decades and decades. Whereas, once that opening occurred, the whole system collapsed. And again, you don't have to write down all these. This is really just summarizing everything we've talked about the past hour or so. Soviet Union by the 80s had clearly lost the ability to proclaim economic or technological growth or even superiority or even catching up with the U.S. and the West by the 60s. So by the 80s, it's just obvious to everybody living in those societies. The Soviet Union, going all the way back to Stalin, had claimed to be the protector of human equality and freedom throughout the world, whereas in the daily reality, they are not. The Hungarian Revolt, the Brezhnev Doctrine, proved that to anybody that had a question about it. And when Gorbachev went into office, he basically admitted to the failures of communism as an economic system by bringing perestroika and glasnost. And when the mass protest movement started in '89, when Gorbachev announced that he wouldn't send in the Soviet armies, that was basically the death of the Brezhnev Doctrine. They will no longer use force to stay in control. And in general, when you take out the political and economic systems that Stalin had built up in his lifetime, in the 30s and 40s mostly, when you take those out of the equation, the repressive system, the terrorizing system, the Soviet Union itself disappears within just a couple years. So the Soviet so-called empire in Eastern Europe is eradicated in '89, and there are mass protests in the Soviet Union itself. And the Soviet leadership on Christmas Day in '91, I think it is, they take a vote to disband the Soviet Union. So you have government leaders voting to end their government, which is a pretty rare thing to do. They're under such pressure. So the Soviet Union breaks down into a whole series of different countries, obviously Russia being the largest one. And they start to build up democratic systems, hopefully. And the United States starts trying to convince them to build capitalist economies, which was unthinkable just 3, 4, 5 years before. The collapse of the Soviet system happened suddenly, without much warning. But of course, looking back, we see that economic stagnation could have been a warning and whatnot. But to the people living at the time, this was shocking stuff. And people throughout the world watch this stuff on their TVs and realize that this is world history being made right in front of their eyes. And I've had friends who were living in Romania at that time, and they remember the people running in the streets, and they remember the violence, and they understood even as very young children. I mean, I was 9 years old at this point, and I understood watching TV that these are big things happening. So this is well known throughout the world, and this is the end of the Cold War, and virtually everybody knew it. And you have the President of the U.S., H.W. Bush, going on TV and literally saying, the fears of the Cold War and nuclear annihilation, these are all gone now. And suddenly we wake up in a new era of human history, and we can write that history as we see fit. One place where that history is not going to be written, that freedom did not grow, was in communist China. The Chinese government basically stayed with their version of the Brezhnev doctrine, which was, when you have mass popular protests, go out and kill those people if they resist. So the Chinese government did send its tanks and soldiers into places like Tiananmen Square and throughout mass rallies in the general country, and they killed thousands of people over the summer of '89 to stay in control. And that is still the official policy of the Chinese government, to control culture, control media, have a one-party system, and anyone who complains about it in almost any way, the government will deal with them, often in very brutal ways. So you still have the purges and the violence, political violence in China. And that dictatorship is still very powerful in China.